The Deep Dive is back, and today we are cutting straight through the overwhelming archives of history to bring you the most fascinating insights. If you need a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed, you're in the right place.
And our target today is a place of just fundamental tension. Rural Victorian England in the 1880s. This was not a settled period, not at all.
No, it was this chaotic and often brutal crossroads, right?
Exactly. You had farming techniques that had survived since the medieval era, suddenly sitting right alongside mass-produced machinery and, well, industrial science.
That is the perfect setup for our mission. Yeah. This deep dive is based on some really extraordinary source material documenting a year-long immersive project.
Right, the resurrection of a working 1880s farm.
The Acton Scott Estate in Shropshire.
Right.
This was an attempt to genuinely inhabit that land.
Yeah, we're talking about an immersive historical experiment. The team had to live, eat, and work using only Victorian methods and technology.
Guided by what was essentially the Bible of the era.
Henry Stevens's monumental Book of the Farm, which was first published back in 1844. It was the go-to guide.
And the guides for our journey, the people who actually, experienced this toil, were Ruth Goodman, who dedicated herself to the domestic life and the dairy.
And then you had Alex Langlands, who was tackling the really difficult world of crop and managing all the livestock.
And Peter Ginn, who was responsible for the technology, the restoration, all the heavy lifting, really.
The initial challenge they faced was, well, it was almost insurmountable. They inherited a 15-acre farm that had been abandoned.
Abandoned and fallow for nearly
50 years. They had to revitalize it completely from scratch.
Yeah.
And this wasn't, some academic research project.
No.
This was about experiencing the daily crushing reality of survival that dictated every single decision a Victorian farmer had to make.
So the core question driving this entire deep dive is, in that huge rush toward modernity, what essential intuitive knowledge was truly lost?
And what efficiency gains were purchased, and at what cost?
Right. And what was the sheer, brutal physical reality of living and working on a farm relying, well, little more than muscle and highly specialized inherited knowledge?
It's a huge question.
Okay, let's unpack this, beginning with the make-or-break element of the
the arable concern. That business of getting crops into the ground and, frankly, praying for a harvest was arguably the single highest stakes endeavor on the farm.
And that was managed primarily by Alex Langlands.
That's right. They dedicated 3 acres to cereal crops like wheat. And the underlying anxiety for any Victorian farmer, and certainly for Alex, was that failure was simply not an...
And failure meant financial catastrophe, right? Especially given the growing competitive pressure from imported grain in the 80s. I mean, what was the real-world consequence of a bad harvest?
It wasn't just losing money, it was losing the farm, losing your home, and potentially winding up in the workhouse.
Which was the ultimate social humiliation.
And an economic death sentence. So this pressure, it meant that the farmer had to constantly seek any advantage, which led to this immediate clash between centuries-old methods and, well, industrial innovation.
And we see that innovation so clearly in the tool. I mean, for millennia, plows were rudimentary things made largely of wood by the local blacksmith.
Right, by the village carriage maker.
But by the 1880s, these were completely superseded by sophisticated, mass-produced iron machines. That moment where the local craft market just died and the factory.
The definitive example the team used was the Ransom's Yorkshire Light Plow, which was manufactured in Ipswich. This machine, introduced way back in the 1840s, was such a revolutionary design.
I read it was so perfectly engineered that it remained the standard plow manufactured continuously for 100
and astonished years. It's incredible.
That's just an unbelievable shelf life for heavy machinery. What made the design so impactful? How did it fundamentally change the science, moving it beyond just craft?
It allowed the farmer, really for the first time, to consistently plow the land to a controlled and even depth. If you think about the older wooden plows, they'd bounce and jump depending on the soil and, the strength of the farmer. They created uneven tilth.
Right, a lumpy field.
Exact. The Ransom's plow, being heavy and precision engineered, created these beautiful uniform furrows across the entire.
And that consistency is everything, isn't it? Because a consistent depth means the seeds are all planted at the optimum level.
Which leads to uniform growth, better root structure, improved land quality, and crucially, a significantly increased crop yield. You just couldn't compete in the 1880s without that sort of precise engineering.
But the technology didn't eliminate the need for muscle.
Oh, not at all. It simply demanded a different type of skill. And we're talking about horsepower. Literally, the power required was immense.
And the team worked with 2 immense drafts, right?
Lion, an 8-year-old Shire, and Prince, a 13-year-old Irish draft. Huge animals.
What's so fascinating is that Alex learned that even with this quote-unquote high-tech iron machine, the skill wasn't in brute force.
No, it was about incredible precision.
He had to constantly adjust the share, the main cutting blade, and the wheel settings by these tiny fractional increments based on how the soil.
It was a continuous feedback loop between the man, the horses, and the machine. If you adjust the share an eighth of an inch too high, you might miss the consistent depth.
And an eighth of an inch too low.
You're just adding immense unnecessary strain on the horses and, of course, on yourself.
And the physical toll is just staggering to contemplate. The Manuel Stevens Book of the Farm, it stated that a farmer aiming for a successful yield was expected to plow a full acre per day.
An acre a day.
And when you calculate the back and forth, turning the horses, following the plow, that meant walking 11 miles.
11 miles a day, from before dawn until dusk.
While constantly wrestling a heavy iron machine and controlling roughly a ton of animal muscle.
The sheer endurance required to maintain that pace, day after day, during that critical plowing window, which might only be a few weeks, is, well, it's unimaginable to most people today. This wasn't a job. It was a physical ordeal.
Yet all that physical effort could be completely undone in an instant by the one element they couldn't control.
The weather.
The weather. Alex faced these immediate, crushing setbacks. Their field was dry and stony, which meant the iron share would frequently just slam into hidden boulders.
When the share hit a stone, it acted like a tripwire. It would kick the plow right out of the perfectly formed furrow.
So it ruined the line, forced him to stop, reposition the horses, and start all over again.
Adding hours to that already brutal 11-mile day.
It just perfectly highlights that perennial anxiety of rural life. You could work harder, own the best equipment, and possess the sharpest skill.
But if the weather didn't cooperate, if the ground was too dry and lumpy instead of nicely damp, your efforts were potentially wasted. And that anxiety about the workhouse would just ramp right back up again.
And we have to connect this entire agricultural revolution to the massive societal pressure.
Absolutely. The 19th century saw Britain's population quadruple. It exploded from about 10 million to 40 million people.
And those people were increasingly concentrated in industrial cities.
And those cities couldn't feed themselves.
Right.
So this demographic explosion meant agriculture had to industrialize. Innovations like the Ransom's plow weren't just neat mechanical tricks.
They were national necessities.
Required to ensure reliable food production and prevent, frankly, mass starvation among the booming urban working class. It was a race against the birth rate.
We've seen how muscle and precise iron machines drove the plowing revolution, but none of this modernization works without fuel and logistics. Let's pivot to the logistics.
How did the Victorians get their heavy goods and fuel? And why was that the real engine of change?
So we're transitioning into the power of coal.
We are. Before the extensive railway network was complete, the canal system was Britain's communication and transport backbone. It peaked at over 4,000 miles of waterways by the 1850s.
And the essential cargo was coal. Canals made moving bulk coal. We're talking massive amounts, sometimes 20 tons per barge, cheap and reliable over long distances.
And you have to remember, moving heavy materials by road was just prohibitively expensive. The roads were terrible, unpaved.
And the cost of maintaining the draft animals was...
That's the critical economic shift. Cheap, easily transportable coal meant steam power became viable everywhere, not just near the coal field. This fueled industry, powered factories, and, subsequently revolutionized food processing.
Both in the cities and eventually on the farm itself.
Right.
But more importantly, the canals and later the railways, they shattered the isolation of the traditional localized farm.
Oh, completely. It created much wider national markets for produce.
So before this, a farmer was often a polyfarmer, right?
Yeah.
They had to grow a bit of everything, crops, chickens, sheep, dairy.
Just to feed their immediate family and the local village.
But once the railway could reliably get butter from Shropshire to London overnight,
farmers could specialize. They could focus only on dairy, or only on high-quality Shropshire sheep, or only on the most profitable crop.
And that specialization maximized efficiency and cemented the structure of a truly national food economy rather than just a patchwork of distance farming.
And once that coal and transportation infrastructure arrived, the next major industrial step was bringing mechanization onto the farm itself.
And nothing symbolizes that industrial shift and the subsequent social trauma quite like the threshing.
By the 1880s, the large steam-powered threshing machine, which is described in detail in the Book of the Farm, was an accepted part of the auto ritual, but its acceptance only came after decades of conflict.
Okay, give us the context. What did this machine replace, and why was its arrival so disruptive?
Well, until the 1830s, the process of separating grain from the stalk threshing was done with a hand flail. It was a deeply physical process.
Hard manual labor.
And it employed thousands upon thousands of unskilled rural men throughout the winter. For many, it was the only reliable work available to them between harvests.
And the machine reduced this critical task from months of necessary work, which paid thousands wages to, what, mere days?
Mere days. It was efficiency at a huge, immediate human cost.
And the historical reality is that this displacement led directly to the Captain Swing riots in the 1830s.
It did. The newly unemployed, feeling completely abandoned and furious, they attacked farms, they burned hayricks, and they literally smashed the threshing machines in these desperate acts of social protest.
So by the 1880s, the beast was accepted, but the memory of that enormous social disruption was still present. It just shows that industrial farming was born out of genuine fear and violence, not just pure innovation.
Now, zooming down to the farm itself, not all machines were massive steam engines. They also employed smaller, horse-powered machinery.
Driven by the Shire horse, clumper, using these large belts and pulleys.
Exact. This brought mechanization down to a micro level, and it was focused on increasing the efficiency of the animals themselves.
So what were these machines designed to do?
We saw Peter Ginn get two essential pieces running. First, the root slicer. They needed it because root vegetables like mangel-wurzels, or mangel-whorls as they were often called.
Those are the big purple and orange beets.
That's them. They were nutrient-rich winter feed. But if you feed them whole, the animals expend way too much energy just chewing and digesting them slowly.
So the root slicer broke them down into smaller, more manageable.
Precisely. It was a giant, hand-cranked, heavy-duty chip. The smaller the food particles, the quicker the animal digested the nutrients, which led to faster fattening and therefore quicker profits for the farmer.
And they mixed this with chaff, cut up straw.
Right, to make an economical, high-energy feed mix.
The second piece was the kibbler, or oats bruiser,
used to grind the grain for the animals.
And this is where we get a great historical connection to. And tell us about James Watt and horsepower.
Well, Watt coined the term horsepower as a unit of measurement when he was marketing his early world-changing steam engines in the late 18th century.
Right. He needed a way for potential customers, who are often people who relied on draft data, to understand the power output of his.
So he created a standard measurement comparing the engine's output to the pulling capacity of a typical draft.
Yeah.
He was literally linking the new machine age back to the traditional agricultural powerhouse.
What's fascinating here, and what Peter found really challenging, is that while these machines maximized profit, they were genuine health and safety nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. They operated using rapidly spinning belts, exposed rollers with razor-sharp teeth, and completely unguarded blades.
If you slipped, if a belt broke, if your coat got caught, the potential for serious injury, losing a finger, a limb, or worse, was immediate and unavoidable.
The quest for farm efficiency came with a truly terrifying occupational hazard.
The fields were brutal and the machines were dangerous, but the work indoors was often just. Let's move inside to the domestic domain, which Ruth Goodman found was a constant, exhausting battle.
The first most pressing need was to restore the cottage, which, as we said, had been abandoned since the 1950s.
And the centerpiece of that restoration was the coal.
It was the absolute lifeblood of the Victorian home. It provided heat, hot water, and the means for all cooking, having replaced that ancient open hearth tradition.
But the installation was far from straightforward. The original range was unusable, forcing them to turn to an adjacent fireplace that had been bricked up.
A huge job for Peter Ginn. He had to clear away 50 years of rubble, old bird nests, and dust. And during the demolition, they found this amazing little artifact.
The salt hole.
The salt hole.
Yeah.
This ingenious, small, dry niche in the chimney wall where salt could be stored to keep it dry and granulated, given the general dampness of old stone houses.
That's a lovely, small detail of domestic ingenuity. While Peter was working on the structure, Ruth faced a steep learning curve with the cooking. She was immediately anxious because cooking on coal is so different from wood.
It's a crucial distinction. Wood smoke often smells pleasant. You might even encourage it to impart flavor.
Right.
Coal smoke, however, is acidic and sulfuric. It tastes, as she put it, foul, and it leaves this noxious taint on the food.
So this shift, it necessitated rewriting entire recipe books. You couldn't allow any coal smoke near the food.
Which forced a move away from roasting meat on a spit in front of an open fire toward completely contained oven roasting using the consistent heat of the coal range. It's a literal technological change demanding a revolution in culinary technique.
While Ruth was wrestling with the coal smoke, Peter was tackling the physical structure, specifically the plastering, which he said felt like a mix of medieval DIY and heavy Victorian.
He started by pulverizing the old, removed lime plaster back into dust for recycling.
Which highlights that recycling back then was just pure, unadulterated physical. Peter noted that this process took him a full day and caused jarring, intense risk.
And the recipe for the plaster itself was fascinating. It was a sloppy mixture of lime dust and sand mixed with water and an essential bonding agent.
Horsehair.
Horsehair. The hair acted like modern fiberglass fiber, knitting the lime mixture together, preventing it from cracking and falling off the wall as it dried.
And the process couldn't be rushed. Lime plaster requires a very slow, careful drying process, sometimes over several or it fails.
Peter even had to put layers of insulating sheet fleeces over his freshly laid mortar at night just to protect it from the frost. It just shows the constant vigilance required against the elements.
Now, the farming manuals, like Stephen's Book of the Farm, they detailed the fields, the technology, crop, but they were remarkably silent on the bird.
It's a profound oversight. Dr. Nicola Verdon, an expert cited in the sources, pointed out that the manuals only ever focused on the tasks that could be directly capitalized: dairy, poultry, food processing, as if the rest of the household miraculously maintained itself.
It suggests the immense, often invisible labor of the farmer's wife was just taken for granted. What did that labor actually entail beyond the few items mentioned in the farming guides?
Oh, it was exhausting. The farmer's wife was typically up before dawn, milking the cows, feeding the pigs and hens, making breakfast for the entire family and any laborers,
Cleaning the bedrooms, making the beds.
and, yes, the necessary but unpleasant duty of emptying the chamber pot. The source states clearly there was very little leisure time indeed.
And a significant part of that domestic toil involved constant pest management. They had to tackle the notorious bed bugs.
Nasty creatures that hide in tiny crevices and can lie dormant for months.
And they're reactivated not by heat, but by the CO2 from your breath at night. Then they come out to bite.
And this was a necessary twice-yearly task, requiring the treatment of cracks in bedding with a mix of turpentine and salt. Can you imagine the smell in that bedroom for days after?
That leads perfectly into the mammoth task, laundry. Ruth documented a 4-day process that often started before 2 in the morning.
2 in the morning, requiring huge amounts of energy and water.
And before the main wash could even begin, they needed specialized stain removal, what we would recognize today as localized dry cleaning.
Right. For ink stains on shirt cuffs, they used milk to help dissolve the ink before the main wash. Fruit stains were highly difficult, requiring the use of butter followed by a strong mix of ammonia and washing soda.
And for glue or stubborn grease stains, they used strong spirits like whiskey or brandy as a powerful solvent applied directly to the spot.
Milk for ink, whiskey for glue. That sounds like a truly complex and potentially highly flammable laundry room.
Once pre-treated, they moved to the wash itself using the dollying process, which is a physical paddle-like action that mimics the agitation of a modern washing machine.
But the real labor-saving industrial product was the cast iron mangle.
Mass production made the mangle, with its heavy squeezing rollers, affordable for more households, cutting down significantly on the grueling work of wringing out heavy waterlogged linen and fabrics by hand.
Work which could easily cause wrist injury or...
But even after all that scrubbing and wringing, there is a final fascinating chemical secret.
Bluing.
Bluing. The clothes, when cleaned with harsh soaps, would often have this slight, natural yellow tint.
So to counteract this, they added synthetic ultramarine, an artificial blue dye, to the final rinse.
Now, the natural source of ultramarine was the costly lapis lazuli stone, historically imported from Afghanistan.
But by the mid-19th century, chemists had synthesized this blue artificially, making it cheap and available. By adding this tiny blue tinge, it acted as a color corrector, making the clothes appear to the human eye to be brilliantly white.
It was an industrial chemical illusion being sold right into the domestic sphere, all for the appearance of perfect cleanliness.
That connectivity between industrial chemistry and the kitchen is truly a defining characteristic of the 1880s.
Let's move into the fall task, specifically food preservation. This was essential for keeping the farm, the family, and the workforce ticking over long.
The team foraged extensively for seasonal wild fruits, damsons, crab apples, sloes, and the preservation methods they used really reflected Britain's position as the center of a massive global...
We're talking about international cuisine landing in a Shropshire cottage.
Absolutely. They made chutney, which is an Indian pickle, and tomato ketchup, which was a hugely popular Victorian relic, using recipes found in domestic books like Eliza Act.
These ingredients and recipes were flowing back into Britain via trade routes established over centuries.
And the innovation in sealing the jars is just classic, adaptable Victorian ingenuity, born of necessity. They didn't have access to modern screw-top lids.
No, instead they relied on prepared pig bladders.
Pig bladders. The bladder was cleaned, prepared, and soaked until it was stretchy and pliable. Once they placed the still wet bladder over the jar opening, they would tie it tight around the neck.
And as the pig bladder dried, it would shrink tight,
creating an extremely effective, airtight, and watertight seal, perfectly preserving the contents for months.
That's incredible. They found a way to use a natural, readily available byproduct of slaughter and turn it into high-tech food preservation technology.
And the preservation wasn't just a kitchen job. It was a major community undertaking, epitomized by cider production from windfall apples using a traditional Victorian cider mill.
Walk us through the process of making that cider. It sounds like a full-scale production.
It was collaborative labor. First, the apples were crushed into a coarse, porridge-like consistence. That pulp was then loaded onto thick woven mats, traditionally called hairs. Hairs, which were stacked on top of each other to form a large square called a cheese.
A cheese, like the dairy product.
Yes, because of its dense, solid, block-like shape. This apple cheese was then placed under immense pressure in the mill to squeeze out every single drop of juice.
Minimizing waste and maximizing yield.
Exactly. And this production had an immediate practical application for farm management recruiting.
Ah, right. We found that the quality of the cider they produced was often a key factor in attracting good laborers, especially for major short-term jobs like the hay harvest.
A farmer with bad cider struggled to hire the best men. It's as simple as that.
So once the juice was collected, it was poured into large wooden casks.
And crucially, they had to top up the casks regularly, often with stream or pond water, but always ensuring the juice avoided contact with metals to keep the air out and prevent impurities that would spoil the fermentation.
And the fermentation process would start naturally in about 5 days,
turning that sweet apple juice into cider.
After dealing with the harvest, Ruth finally had a chance to cook their first substantial meal on the new coal range. Boiled mutton.
And this wasn't lamb.
No, why was mutton from an adult sheep the economic staple?
It was entirely about profit maximization. It was far more economic to crop the sheep for 8 full years of wool production before slaughtering it for meat.
Lamb.
Mutton was the sustainable economic choice for the working farm. And mutton actually served as an interesting social status marker in the 1880s.
Right. Mutton eaters were considered to be people who were doing okay but not great.
Solid middle class or well-to-do farmers. It indicated security without lavish.
The feasting crescendoed, of course, at Christmas.
Which was becoming this profoundly sentimental and nostalgic event during this era, driven by concerns about the erosion of traditional rural life. The traditions they revived and adopted really cemented the Victorian Christmas we largely recognized.
And the menu reflected this new industrial age. Turkey was taking over from goose as the centerpiece bird.
Primarily because the widespread railway network made the larger, more popular bird widely available across the country.
They also prepared more unusual items, like cows.
Considered a richer, stronger flavor to contrast with the lighter poultry. And the Christmas pudding was a monumental effort, a costly, luxurious dish packed with dried fruits, expensive spirits.
And often containing silver sixpences placed inside for luck.
And even in the kitchen, technology assisted the feat. To roast that large turkey, they employed 2 fascinating gadgets. First, a clockwork device called a bottle jack.
So it's essentially a wind-up mechanism that turned the meat slowly in front of the coal range.
It eliminated the need for a boy or servant to manually turn the spit for hours on end.
And it was paired with a hastener.
A large, curved, reflective metal screen placed behind the meat.
So if I'm understanding correctly, that hastener is like a primitive reflective shield, bouncing the heat back onto the food.
It really is a clockwork kebab shop, ensuring the meat cooks perfectly and much faster than normal open.
Beyond the food, Christmas was defined by homemade energy, reflecting that fear of losing tradition.
We see the resurgence of old carol and the central role of parlor game, like shadow, replacing modern distraction. This emphasis on family celebration and charity was cemented by cultural phenomena, particularly Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol,
which coincided with the popularization of Christmas cards and crackers.
Moving from feasting to the future of the farm, let's talk livestock. Alex and the team had to select breeds that were ideal for the efficiency-focused Victorian farmer.
Meaning they needed high output for low end.
The primary cattle were shorthorn cows. Henry Stevens' Book of the Farm extensively details how these were bred to perfection by the Calling brothers in the early 1800s.
And their revolutionary technique was in
selectively mating closely related animals that possessed desirable traits to accentuate those features in the offspring.
And the result, the shorthorn, was revolutionary. It became known as the first real dual-purpose cow,
excelling both at high milk production for dairy and as prime beef cattle. They matured and fattened much quicker than older, less specialized longhorn breeds, significantly increasing profitability.
Now, here is where we get a profound intellectual insight from the source material. Stevens himself, writing long before modern genetics was established, voiced this profound unease about the practice.
He did. He noted that inbreeding was a technique possessed of great power for good or evil.
Wait, he questioned the ethics of it. This shows an early awareness, long before modern genetics and ethical debates, of the moral consequence of pushing efficiency over nature.
It really does.
What does it say about the Victorian mindset that they were achieving such success while simultaneously feeling uneasy about playing God with animals?
I think it suggests that they understood that extreme specialization could lead to fragility, that by accentuating one trait, you might inadvertently introduce weaknesses or reduce the overall robustness of the breed.
So Stevens was essentially advocating for balance,
recognizing the danger inherent in pushing nature too far solely for profit.
They also brought in Shropshire sheep, famed for their excellent meat and dense wool, bred from local wild sheep in the 1840s.
And the focus, come late autumn, shifted entirely to ensuring a successful lambing season, which dictates the farm's profit for the next year.
The first technique employed was flush.
This involved moving the ewes to fresh, lush, high-quality pasture to rapidly improve their body condition in the weeks leading up to mating.
And the goal was to increase the likelihood of them conceiving twins.
A well-fed ewe is far more likely to shed multiple eggs.
Once the ewes were in peak condition, it was time for the ram, Fred. And the team employed a technique called rattling,
which involved painting Fred's chest with a thick mixture of red ochre, linseed oil, and pig fat.
So when Fred mated with a ewe, he would leave a telltale red mark on her back.
And this provided the farmers with confirmation of pregnancy, allowing them to track which ewes had been mated and when, which was crucial for predicting the lambing schedule months later.
But shepherding demanded absolute, constant vigilance, especially when it came to the inherent fragility.
Richard Spencer, an experienced sheep farmer, gave Alex a very stark piece of advice. He said, "A sheep is the only animal in God's creation looking for the quickest way to die."
That's terrifying context for novice shepherds.
It highlights the high-stakes pressure. They had to learn how to check for imminent birth. A key sign was the appearance of sticky wax on the ewe's udder,
a sure sign that milk production was about to begin,
meaning lambing was hours or days away.
Alex also learned the vital, nuanced physical technique for inspecting a sheep without injuring himself or the animal, the judo.
This wasn't about brute force, which would just scare the animal. It was about applied knowledge and leverage.
By locking his knee into the ewe's shoulder and rocking gently back,
Alex could use the principle of levers and the sheep's own weight to safely roll a 10-stone ewe onto its rear to check the udder or assist with a difficult birth. It's a perfect example of applied physical intelligence, not just muscle.
And the assisted birth process was one of the highest pressure moments on the farm. Alex had to insert his hand to check the alignment of the lamb.
It must be the nose and 2 front feet first, or the lamb will not survive.
And if the lamb was misaligned, Alex had to manipulate the fetus manually, often deep inside the ewe.
A delicate and distressing process. Once the lamb was pulled, they had to immediately clear the placenta and mucus from its nose and mouth, rub its chest vigorously with straw to stimulate circulation.
And crucially, get the lamb up and nursing immediately to ensure it received the vital colostrum.
The success of the farm literally hinged on remembering and executing every single one of those precise steps in a moment of cold, high-stress crisis.
And while Alex was wrestling with the fragile life of the lambs, Peter had his largest building challenge.
Constructing insulated pigsties for the ginger-colored Tamworth pigs, a breed excellent for bacon.
Pigs are creatures of comfort and require warmth, especially for optimal fat. How did Peter achieve the necessary insulation? Only Victorian method.
This is a brilliant example of Victorian ingenuity and practical recycling. To prevent the cold from coming up through the floor, Peter laid down a thick layer of hundreds of recycled wine bottles.
Wine bottle laid on their sides.
Hundreds of placed on their sides beneath the concrete floor slab.
So he used the air trapped inside the bottles as insulation. It's a rudimentary but highly effective form of modern subfloor.
It demonstrates incredible resourcefulness, using what today we would just call trash.
And this emphasis on authenticity was intense. The landlord, Mr. Ack, insisted on historical accuracy, even down to the nails.
They used blacksmith cut nails, even though cheaper, mass-produced wire nails were becoming common by the 1880s. The finished sty had to meet the exact size and structural recommendations right out of Henry Stevens' Book of the Farm.
Moving into the dead of winter and early spring, the team discovered the necessity of relying on local experts and traditional, often nearly forgotten skills.
Especially when modern, easily accessible supplies just weren't available.
They needed to build a substantial farmyard fence from scratch.
So Peter and the local woodsman had to track and fell a suitable oak tree. The process was exhausting. A 5-hour struggle just to fell the tree precisely where they wanted it to land, using only axes and handsaw.
Then they used Clumper, the Shire horse, for tissue,
which is the heavy work of dragging the massive heavy log out of the forest to the saw pit.
At the saw pit, the work was slow and precise,
Peter learned the difficulty of hand-sawing logs with a part standing above and below the log. The men employed for this job were called sawyers. It took hours for one log to be processed.
which emphasizes the rapid decline of this profession.
Because industrial sawmills, powered by steam, could process hundreds of logs in a single day, destroying the economic viability of the sawyer trade in rural areas almost overnight.
It just illustrates the relentless power of industrial scale.
We also saw the near extinction of certain crafts, like that of the traditional basket.
Owen Jones, one of a handful of people still practicing his craft in Britain. He was called in to make baskets specific to the Lake District in West Midlands.
Tell us about his craft. What materials did he use, and why were his baskets so enduring?
He used local, readily available material, local oak and hazel, rather than imported willow. The materials had to be softened and made pliable by boiling them, a process called ripe,
Before they could be woven together tightly without the use of any fixings or nails.
That durability and sustainability is the Jones's basket could last for decades and could easily be repaired, illustrating a form of environmental friendliness that we often forget was inherent pre-industrial craft.
And these baskets were absolutely essential on the farm for everything from broadcast sowing seed to harvesting root crops.
For quick and robust security of the farmyard, they relied on more permanent tech. For the farmyard fence posts, Peter cut the rest of the logs by cleaving,
Using wedges to split the wood along the grain. This was exponentially faster than sawing and provided durable split rails.
Meanwhile, Ruth was quickly repairing large gaps in the sheep field hedge using wattle work-weaving hazel brand wooden posts.
It's a very simple, quick technique expected to last a very long time, often 20 to 50 years, showing how temporary fixes could become long-term infrastructure.
Finally, we have to discuss the major friction point in the Victorian side, the relationship between the tenant farmer and the landowner.
Particularly concerning game birds and rabbit.
Tenant farmers like Alex struggled to stop game birds, specifically pheasants and rabbits, from eating their crops.
Yet every single one of those animals was the landlord's exclusive property, protected by law and not to be touched by the farmer.
This created immense tension. Alex and Peter actually participated as beaters on a formal pheasant,
which was a sport invented in the late 19th century. Their job was to walk in a line, creating noise to drive the birds toward the gentleman holding the gun.
And the technological innovation here was massive. The modern cartridge and the break-action gun, invented around this time, cut reloading time from minutes to mere seconds.
This made the sport far more efficient, allowing the landowner to kill many more birds in a shorter time.
But Alex, frustrated by the crop damage, channeled his inner poacher by ferreting for rabbits with local experts Doug and Bob Jones,
who had 50 years of experience. This highlighted the major contention point of the Victorian countryside, the game law.
The game laws were incredibly strict, and they were the source of huge civil tension. They allowed police to stop and search laborers returning from work at any time, looking for traps, nets, or illegally caught game.
This power was often used randomly, allowing the police to harass the working class, leading to immense resentment. Rabbits, being vermin to the farmer but game to the landlord, were a constant source of friction.
And Alex was taking a genuine, though small, risk by ferreting.
But the Victorian moral code, driven by widespread hunger, strongly stood against waste. Any pheasants from the chute or rabbits caught by Alex.
Ruth consulted the family save-all recipe book to make dishes like hashed pheasant and rabbit pudding.
Rabbit pudding made with a filling suet crust pastry was a true rural staple. Simple, cheap, filling, and ensuring nothing from the animal went to waste.
It connects everything back to survival. Every part of the animal and the harvest had to be used, which is a moral approach born entirely of necessity and skill.
So what does this all mean for us? This deep dive into the 1880s farm has shown us that the period was less about one singular historical age and more about a chaotic intersection.
Centuries-old, unforgiving toil, sitting directly next to terrifyingly efficient modern industry.
The efficiency gains, particularly in transportation, the canals, the railways, and heavy mechanization, like the threshing machine, they fundamentally changed society.
They made food specialization possible and enabled the feeding of massive industrial cities. That was the victory of the Victorian age.
But the reality on the ground was that the sheer physical labor, the reliance on applied inherited skill, and the unpredictable brutality of nature remained a brutal daily reality that no technology could completely erase.
You still had to walk 11 miles behind a plow. You still had to rely on a steady hand to deliver a lamb.
What's truly valuable here is the enduring knowledge and intuition, the lost crafts and skill, the intuition of the plowman who could read the land, the stonemason who understood how to mix mortar to survive the frost,
and the basket weaver who knew the local materials well enough to make something durable.
And we saw the incredible, adaptable Victorian ingenuity, from sealing jars with prepared pig bladders to insulating a concrete floor using hundreds of recycled wines.
A profound connection between discarded objects and essential. The ability of the Victorian farmer was measured in their physical strength and their deep applied knowledge, materials, and process. It was intensely personal survival.
Which leads us to a final provocative thought for you to mull or explore on your own.
We are so reliant today on instant gratification, complex global supply chains, and highly specialized invisible infrastructure. If all that instantly vanished, how many of us, given our reliance on digital and automated systems, possess the fundamental physical applied skills needed just to put a meal on the table, to keep the house warm, or even simply get a heavy gatepost in the ground?
That knowledge, held in the calloused hands of the Victorian farmer, is worth rediscovering, even if only in our mind. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.
We'll catch you next time.